Good morning. Good morning and welcome, Art Basel Conversations. Biennials are constantly changing and shifting, and so this morning we're going to talk about what can biennials do. Very grateful and excited to welcome our speakers. Ralph Rugoff. Ralph is director of the 2019 Venice Biennial and also director of the Hayward Gallery. Zoe Butt, who's a co-curator at the Sharjah Biennial coming up, and also artistic director of the Factory Contemporary Arts in Ho Chi Minh City. Eva Gonzalez Sancho, who's curator of the Oslo Biennial. And Shatwell Patel, who's a researcher and a writer based in London. And then, of course, our esteemed, much-loved moderator, Andres Santo, who's an author and curatorial strategy consultant based in New York. Thank you very much, Andres.
Thank you, Mari. Hello. Amazing curators of the world, good morning. More amazing curators in the audience, more amazing arts writers. Thank you, Jane, for that lovely article in the art newspaper. And thank you, Art Basel, for doing this, and for all of you turning up and showing who the truly committed art lovers are, the ones who are present at these talks, which are such an important part of Art Basel. Our topic is biennials, and soon you will learn what that word actually means. Shweta, I'm looking at you. No, hold your guns. But it is from him that it will be fully revealed what a biennial is. In case you haven't noticed, we're in a biennial boom. There's probably now a biennial for almost every day of the year, luckily not on the same day, but dispersed. They are important pilgrimage sites for the art world, much like this place. They are, for cities and for nations, emblems of pride and cultural vitality and aspiration. They stake out positions, albeit sometimes somewhat blurry ones. They can boost careers, both of artists and of curators. They sort of take stock of where the art world is, where the conversation is at a particular moment. And as Mari just said, they're also changing with the times, like everything else. So today we ask, what can a biennial accomplish? We'll look at all the different shapes and sizes they come in. We'll try to talk about some of their opportunities, some of their challenges, and sort of how they reflect current realities in the art world. Mari has already introduced our wonderful group, and I'll say a few more things about their illustrious resumes as we get into it. But suffice it to say, we couldn't have a better group here because we have creators of biennials past, creators of ongoing biennials, smaller biennials, bigger biennials, very big biennials. So they're an amazing group, and you've already clapped. But one more time, please, round of applause, amazing people. They're going to say great things. Okay. So this particular discussion started as a conversation with Shweta, who, after having worked on the Kochi Museum's biennial, went off and became a scholar and has been working on some research on biennials, which is in fact summarized in this. Is this out now? Yes. This is a publication called On Curating, and they did this global biennial survey, and we thought it would be a fantastic opportunity to launch a conversation around this. And so what I'm going to do is pull everyone in, but we'll start with Shwetal because he has sort of real news about biennials. So Shwetal, just as by way of background, it was in 2010 that you helped develop the Kochi Biennale, and you are now working on a PhD and doing writing and consulting, but this has been your baby. So tell us, first of all, what exactly is a biennial, and then what are the other headlines from this report?
Thank you. Well, I have to point out Professor Dorothy Richter here from Zurich University Arts. I'm doing my doctoral studies in the UK at the Winchester School of Art, and I started in 2015 after having worked on Kochi Biennale. So my PhD subjects are not unrelated, but it's not exactly this. When I met Dorothy, I think about a year and a half ago, there was a discussion on decolonization and so on, and I was part of a symposium that she put together here in Basel. And at that time, we got into a conversation, and they have a publication called On Curating. And so I said it would be very interesting to work with the students to see if we can map the global biennials and see how many there are, because we were discussing this earlier, there's this sort of sense that there's hundreds of biennials, or we're in an age of sort of biennialization, but we have very little empirical information. It's a really fraught exercise because new biennials are appearing all the time. Some biennials are kind of becoming defunct and so on. And so how do we define a biennial? And when we in the research, when we talk about biennials, we actually mean large scale recurring exhibitions that have they can be triennials, that can happen in 4 years or 5 years like Documenta, or even 10 years like Munster. But this kind of exhibition has been summarized as being biennials, but it doesn't mean that they all have to happen every 2 years.
And is there a word that you've come up with to replace, like one word that is not bi, but denotes the whole set?
Very good question. No, I haven't.
Like perennials.
Yes, I suppose. Yeah, but these words are used.
Never stop.
Well, they are in a way perennials, as we can see.
Yeah, well, that's been used as well. The perennial, large-scale, recurring exhibitions, periodic exhibitions. So these are it's a sort of umbrella term for these kinds of exhibitions. What we're looking at is a certain set of characteristics, and they seem to display similar characteristics.
And what are those?
I think, perhaps biennial curators here can answer, but I think that there is a sort of international language that's emerging through biennials, so kind of a biennial art, if you like, but also kind of biennial formats. So you have, lots of site-specific work, you have a thematic curatorial sort of a drive, discursive talks programs, education programs. So these sorts of, on these, for a period of, 2 to 6 months in the case of Venice, but mostly around 3 months. So these are now becoming characteristics of these large-scale exhibitions. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, within that, of course, there's a lot of variation, but these seem to be the general.
Mm-hmm. And let's use just a little bit of Biennial 101. So the first biennial was?
1895 in Venice.
Okay, and then came, what were the first?
Sao Paulo.
And then there was the first triennial, was?
In Delhi.
In Delhi, in fact.
Nehru started, and yeah.
And so if we went back, let's say, to the 1960s, how many biennials would have been around that time?
Less than 10, I would say. I mean, the research is published here. It's available to download from the ZHDK website. So, but probably less than 10.
Handful then.
Handful,
and
handful.
Today, what are you saying?
Between 315 and 320. It's very difficult to put an exact number on. And in fact, I think it's not. I don't think one should try and put an exact number on it because.
Right.
Yeah.
So you include in that visual arts and other art forms?
Yeah. So we're looking at contemporary art forms. So sculpture, obviously visual arts, which encompasses sculpture and performance and film and so on. But there are, for instance, Münster Sculpture Pacific, or Venice Architecture, or design biennials, which generally which either oscillate between. In the case of Gwangju, you'll have design one year and visual arts the next. And in Venice, you have dance, you have theater, but that happens on an annual basis. But so it really varies. But generally, more than 75% are visual arts biennales, which include the other disciplines. But there are many biennials, and there are increasingly more biennials that will focus on one specific discipline.
Okay, now last little number question. So, and can you tell us about the geographic concentration and where are biennials sprouting up the most?
Well, that was interesting. There is a sense that there's a lot more new biennials emerging in Asia, and we found that out of the 316 that we calculate, 136 were in Europe. So if you consider the population of Europe, so in per capita terms, that's a lot of biennials per person. In Asia, we have second highest is around 80 biennials, and then in North America, you have around 60, 65 biennials. But North America has this sort of phenomenon of the juried exhibition, which generally happen on a 2-yearly basis. So they get counted as biennials, but they're really more held in museums or, that's a slightly different phenomenon. And then we see a rise now in Latin America and also in Africa, but from a much lower base. But generally, the growth has slowed down somewhat in Europe, but it's actually picking up, especially since the last decade in Asia.
Right. Great. Well, that gives you a little sense of the playing field. So now we're going to look at some specific scenarios, and we'll go to you, Zoe. So you have a very interesting life because you live in Vietnam, but where you're overseeing this art initiative in Vietnam. But you're spending a lot of time in Sharjah now as one of the, I think, 3 curators of Sharjah. And this itself, I think, is one of the features of Biennales now, having curators from all around the world coming in, working together, bringing different global mindsets. You've also worked on the Asia-Pacific Triennial, and you've done many exhibitions and earned many accolades. So you are someone who has a very particular take on biennials, insofar as you can't look at my notes. It's supposed to be a surprise. No. So anyway, you really are committed to the idea of the biennial as a kind of platform for activism in a way, or political engagement. So could you talk a little bit about that philosophy of biennials and also how it relates to the work you're doing now in Sharjah?
Thank you. I think activism is a bit of a complicated word and needs to be contextualized. You have to understand that the place where I live and work is a communist country. Freedom of expression is virtually null. So to speak socially politically, I'm talking about being able to give common decency of human rights. It's not perhaps to be misnomered as speaking out against an institutional infrastructure for the arts that might be commonplace for a biennial in the West. From my own perspective as a curator, I'm surrounded by some of the most incredible artists who take risks at showcasing pieces of history or particular cultural or religious opinions and choosing art as the main arena to which to give public form of expression. In that vein, I think exhibition making is important, but I have to say in my part of the world, exhibitions are wholly misunderstood. We don't have a public that is versant with what defines contemporary art. So the biennial platform in Asia, in my mind, has done some very instrumental things in giving spaces to contemporary artists to speak, beyond the market, which tends to limit definitions according to taste of cash. But then it's also become a very important arena to raise issues that are very locally specific to that place and particular time. My decision to say yes to working with the Sharjah Art Foundation takes a longer sort of reflection also with the work I did with the Asia-Pacific Triennial in Australia. Both of these entities are attached to institutions that have a memory. And their ability to not only showcase but also collect means that the system behind the Biennale production cares about audience making to a level that sits beyond just the timeframes of which that biennial might take place. And for me, that's really important. I think that the local community that exists beyond the frame of a duration of a show, you can find results. When I worked on the Asia-Pacific Triennial, the results of working in a local environment where, in the beginning, the decision for the APT was a political move on the Australian government to engage Australia with the Asia-Pacific region. Come 6 editions later, you have a local population that really can identify the synergies between an Indigenous Australian form of expression or, say, Indonesian. And I think that that's actually a real gift for what contemporary art can do for a general public, but largely because that institution has public programs that extends the validity of those works beyond just the initial duration of that show. So to return to your question about activism, again, I'd just like to highlight that there's many definitions for why people think on a social political platform, and it's very important to showcase and put some specificity to the voice that's trying to give the speech. For the Sharjah Biennial, I myself am one of 3 curators, as you say. My own contribution is very much unapologetically speaking from the region in which I live and work. And there'll be a strong focus from Southeast Asia. And a lot of the stories that will be presented look at a particular social political history often overlooked in the aesthetic histories that are taught and circulated in my part of the world.
Yes, I was very pleased that the third curator is going to be introduced in the Caribbean, speaking of overlooked.
And Claire's actually in the audience.
Oh, she's here.
Yes,
Hello.
she's up the back.
Yeah, we just saw you in Berlin. And we could talk about the Berlin Biennale as an interesting case, certainly a fantastic press response. So just before we go on, at one point you did make, I think, is really relevant, which is, all of the points made are relevant, but one point that I'd like to underscore is this question of how do you avoid it from being sort of one momentary big bang versus how do you create a more year-round impact with these, and how are you thinking about that, for example, in Sharjah?
I think education plays a role in being able to give voice to that. In that end, a part of what I'm trying to develop is a series of toolkits that I'm creating with visual artists. In effect, these toolkits are already part of the practice of the artistic collectives that I'll be working with. There's a vast number of artists today that are teachers and create incredible informal zones of learning, and I'm deeply indebted to their methodologies, their pedagogical forms of discourse, but also their playfulness with learning. And these specific toolkits, I'm hoping, can be shared not only within the region of Sharjah, but communities around the world.
And what are your, last question for now, what are your sort of touchstones? I mean, as you go about this, which recent biennials do you look to where you say, that was great, inspirational examples? To put you on the spot.
It's a very tough question for me. I must admit that as someone who's been working for artists for a decade, I haven't had the pleasure of seeing as many biennials as I'd like to have seen. But I hear a lot about Kochi, and I'm actually looking forward to getting there at the end of this year. I've got a lot of respect for the amount of response on the part of artists. They've enjoyed participating in Kochi. And that counts a lot for me, artists' reactions to participation. Gwangju is one of the platforms in my region that is very important. I've always learnt a lot from Documenta. Not altogether agreed, but learnt a lot. For me, it's about learning fundamentally. Experience and learning is number one.
Speaking of Kochi, we should acknowledge Bozak Isamachari right here in the front row who funded that. And of course, it's an artist-run biennial, which I think partly explains the great love people have for it. Ralph, it was a providential development that while we were planning this discussion, you were announced to be the next curator of the Venice Biennale. You are, of course, at the Hayward Gallery now in London, where you have this wonderful Libo exhibition right now. Full disclosure, I've known Ralph since he was primarily a practicing arts writer at the LA Weekly, which is now, 20 years ago? 15 years ago. You've made a fantastic transformation into an arts leader of institutions, first at the California College of Arts and now at the Hayward. But I think your journalistic mindset is still very much alive, the critic's eye. Along the way, we organized a whole range of wonderful exhibitions, although I think my favorite is still the micro-miniature sculpture exhibition at the, wasn't that you? At the Museum of Jurassic Technology?
It wasn't at the Jurassic Day, but
Oh, wasn't it?
I wrote something.
You wrote something about it. I just have this memory because it was such an off-the-wall topic, and this is sculpture, inside the eye of the needle, Seven Dwarfs kind of art. Anyway, you cannot yet talk about details of Venice. I'm sure we're all very curious what you're thinking, but there will be a time for that, so we'll sort of keep it at 30,000 feet. I guess I'd love to hear also your touchstones, but maybe the big question, which I think must be on your mind, which is how do you bring together a coherent exhibition with 100 artists that are somehow representative of much of the world?
Is that on? Thanks, Andres. And I think the nature of biennales has nothing to do with the nature of making good exhibitions. So it's automatically a real challenge to do one of these. I think there's more specific ways to define a biennale than you have so far. I mean, I do think they always have a really precise geographic definition, whether it's a municipal, a national, a regional, or a global focus. And with that is some degree of an aspiration to be encyclopedic. That is tempered somewhat by the idea of a theme, which might narrow down to this arena in which you're going to try to be encyclopedic. But I think this grandiose sense of being comprehensive, of examining an entire region of whatever size, does lend itself to delusions of grandiosity, and I think most curators fall into this trap of thinking that a biennial is this universal platform in which you can remake the world of philosophy and art through rhetorical constructions. And that one of the things that I always find quite strange about biennials is that the rhetoric of the curators often seems to exist in a parallel universe to the experience I have as a visitor looking at the artworks, which, because interesting artists are always addressing multiple concerns at the same time in the same work, they can rarely behave in the ways that a theme might suggest they would. That they're going to escape the parameters of whatever curatorial framework has been put on them. And then in terms of a global biennial, the dream is that all art from all these different cultures can somehow speak together and make this wonderful, vibrant cocktail of cultural difference, which, when drunk by the visitor, inspires new ways of thinking and seeing about those differences. And I do think that, one of the utopian sides of a Biennale is that it's bringing together art from all over the world and offering the visitors a chance to have conversations with artists from all over the world, to get information delivered by artists from very different parts of the world that you might only know through your local media channels, whether it's from internet news, television news, radio, forms of information that are often very circumscribed and rigid. And so that for many people, encountering work from the other side of the globe gives them a different profile of how people might be thinking there. Just as artists offer us different ways of thinking in whatever culture you're in. But I think the challenge, and this is something I'm thinking about, I don't have an answer to, is how you allow an audience to have a sense of the context that a lot of this work is referring to, when that takes a long time to establish. And as much as I generally do not find art fairs to be a very good way of experiencing art, one of the things that interested me, just going around yesterday, was there's something about the booth that is a bit like the Cabinet of Curiosities, which is the antecedent of the museum, and in a way of the exhibition. This was, in the 17th century, a collector would have a collection of all kinds of things, natural history, specimens, works of art. And part of your visit was their performance of telling you how they gutted everything, where it came from, what it meant, what it might mean. A role which now is usually played by what in America we call docents, people who go around and lead you through the show and are usually repeating third-hand information, which often has nothing to do anymore with what the artworks are about. But here, there's a gallerist who obviously is got motivations that have to do with selling, or getting you interested in the work, but they all sit down and talk to you in great detail and tell you what this artist's work means, where he's coming from, and what cultural context. And that makes a huge difference in terms of what you then get out of it. So how you can do this in a Biennale format, obviously there's a lot you can probably do with online information which people can access if they're interested. But it's a tricky question.
Before we move on, I want Eva to come into this, but I mean, you get the appointment. You're the next one for Venice. And what are you doing? I'm not saying where your thinking is specifically, but what are the sort of curatorial stretching exercises that you're doing in order to sort of mount this challenge?
It's really looking at a lot of art and in different places and meeting with a lot of artists and having conversations with people. I mean, every time I have a conversation with an artist, I have another idea about how to move forward. And so for me, all the artists are co-curators with me. It's all collaboration.
And what are these artists, what are their gripes and what are their biggest hopes when they're talking to you?
Well, we're really not talking about gripes so much, that we might be talking about challenges. Mm-hmm. And I think, say, one challenge now is just the fact that the attendance for all these big biennales, like Documenta and Venice, keeps going higher and higher. No matter whether the reviews are good or bad, it makes no difference. And in my optimistic moments, I think maybe people really are finding that this art is an important alternative to corporate-produced culture. But in my less optimistic moments, when I'm observing the behavior of people in these big biennials, and most of them are interested in taking selfies in front of artworks, or just taking pictures of all the artworks so they can post them and let everyone know they lead an interesting life. So how do you get people to engage with work and not think that this is just a great background for your social media?
Well, lots of great themes on the table already, but that actually is a perfect segue to Eva Gonzalez-Sancho, who is one of the curators of the Oslo Biennale, which is a different beast again, and to some extent is an antidote to some of the questions that have been identified. You're a native of Spain. You've done lots of exhibitions. You've been involved in artist residency programs. And since 2014, you've been a curator of Oslo Pilot, which is an initiative to help design what would be the best format for this future art biennial in Oslo, which is now has been fully funded by the Oslo government. That is now in the planning stage. You also lecture on exhibition history at Metz University. So this is a different kind of biennale, and it's influenced by your thinking, quite critical thinking of biennales in general. So tell us a little bit about what it is like to build a biennale with a city that is an entirely outdoor biennial and completely funded by government and therefore has no commercial hinterland.
So, thank you, Andreas. The first thing is the city of Oslo. It's not the government. It's the city of Oslo.
City government, yes.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought very interesting in how this started is that the city of Oslo, the Agency for Cultural Affairs, they wanted to have a biennial in Oslo. But instead of going for importing an already existing model, they looked for a curatorial team in order to define what should be, or what could be, the format, the most adequate format for Oslo. I quite agree that we need to know also where we're talking from and which context we're working with. They called for, they make this open call, and my colleague Perguna Edkeberg, myself, we responded and we started thinking about what could be this format. And I thought that was very interesting because we have been mentioning before arriving here, you told me there are around 320 biennials and 20 have disappeared, which is not that many biennials disappearing, but you have some biennials. And coming back to the city of Oslo, I thought that was quite interesting to invest time and money and effort in studying first what to do and then actually to do it. And not test out with the biennial itself, maybe, and then see what happens. So one of the particularities of this initiative was that the Commission was very clear. The idea was to make the biennial outdoors, in public space, which for my colleague and I, it is not, of course, the physical public space of a city, but public spheres that could include media, newspapers, radio, whatever, but it is, that goes farther beyond what is the physical public space of a city. And our first thought was that, of course, if we want to talk about public spheres, we really need to know the context. So Oslo Pilot was dedicated to study this context and to study the fact that, of course, the difference probably between showing an artwork, one of the difference outdoors or inside, is that the meaning of this artwork is profoundly, maybe could be mutable in this space which is changing all the time, which is the city. So how to deal with that, how to deal also with many questions linked to the reading of an artwork that maybe are preserved or protected within the exhibition room, but are much more vulnerable in the space of the city. So we worked around a series of questions, time-related questions in the reading of works. And then we came up at the end of that study, which was an experimental and base research project. We came up with a format that has been approved that I cannot unveil today, which is a biennial, but it's not, because we have decided to go for the generic term biennial, but the recurrence is not going to be 2 years. We have already started, even if I cannot go into specifics today, but we have started with something we were very much interested in, which is art production and what could be the production frame for a biennial. Because what we were very much interested in is how a biennial could participate of, let's say, a new institutional ecology where the biennial could impulse other initiatives or collaborations. So how a biennial can work within the local art scene, but also with the international art scene. So the first step have been to open, it is not yet done, but if you are in Oslo next week, we're going to open this freestanding building of almost 4,000 square meters, which is going to host artist studios, the residency for the visiting program for the biennial, and which is going to be also the headquarters of the biennial. So which is a way for us of indicating that the biennial we want it to be also an initiative which is helping out and which is trying to get in dialogue with how to build up the artistic scene in Oslo. And then maybe the last thing to say, that one of the particularities, and this is why we were also interested in going through this research about how an artwork the meaning of an artwork could move or could change in the public space of Oslo, is just to say that Oslo is nowadays the most rapid growing city in Europe. So it is 600,000 inhabitants nowadays, and we are expecting 200,000 more within the 15 next years, which is amazing. So yeah, we are dealing also with that.
So in this
situation.
respect, your biennial is a cultural policy tool. In other words, it is the city is investing in this biennial, or correct me if I'm wrong, to help catalyze in a way the emergence of an art scene, or what exactly is, why is the city investing so much money in it? It's not just to allow the artistic conversations, but to in a way help this scene, this growing city's art scene emerge, isn't it?
The idea of working on artistic production and other things that we will announce, because the conceptual frame and the exact time frame will be announced within next month, is the curatorial proposal. Mm-hmm. We were not asked to work on that, but we thought that if we were working in public spheres, we really wanted also to work in how is the construction of the city made in terms also of what is its artistic value. And intellectual value. So we really wanted to work in artistic production, maybe also because that has to do with the fact that both Berguna and I, we come from the production side. So we have been directing institutions, but we have very much in contact with artists and the production of new works. And, to give you an example, it's not to, but I was seeing Lara Almarcegui's work outside. Just to tell you that, I remember 20 years ago we've made this first time with all the materials and everything. I'm very pretty much in how to make possible, as it is the case for my colleague Per Gunnar. So that was the curatorial proposal to work on that, and because we think that makes sense to do it if we are working in public space.
Great. Well, there are a whole bunch of issues here on the table, but just to maybe we can all talk about it together a little bit. I would like to have all of your thoughts about, and maybe Shweta, you wrote about this, is why are we suddenly in this vast proliferation? I mean, to go back to the beginning of this conversation, a handful of biennales 30, 40 years ago, 320 today. What is the impetus behind these projects? What is leading to this sort of popcorn-like expansion?
Well, that's what we were trying to answer. So it's a difficult one to answer because, regionally it varies. For instance, the Kochi Biennale was started by two artists, both Christian Chai and Riaz Como. The Venice Biennale was started by the King of Savoy, but then taken over by artists. So there's various reasons why biennials seem to proliferate. But it does seem, and certainly in the Global South, in the absence of museums and cultural infrastructure, traditional Western models of cultural infrastructure, biennials fill that space where different kinds of exhibition making can kind of come to the fore. So generally we see in the West, I think in Europe, lots of state governments are supporting biennials. In the Global South, in the absence of state support, lots of private and other sorts of philanthropic and also global funding agencies, Western governments and so on are funding biennials. It's a really complex question. I think that it's something that we couldn't find enough data on in terms of where the money is coming from to form these kinds of exhibitions, because they are capital intensive. They take a lot of resources, especially when you start to invite international artists to far-flung places. Everything gets extremely difficult. So we don't know, but one of the reasons we did this survey was to also look into the nature of art production today and why we're seeing the kind of art that we're seeing globally. And to Ralph's point, I think it's difficult to encapsulate global practices, especially from a Western idiom in a Western setting, because the nature of art education today and how curatorial studies, which is also proliferating, is taught, I think is affecting the kinds of work, the kind of art that we're seeing, not just in biennials, which then filters through to the market. And, biennials have served, especially from the Global South, have been one of the platforms for which artists then ascend to global prominence. Various examples of that. So this is really what we're trying to sort of figure out. What's going on to art production today in relation to this biennialization, but that biennial boom is also mirrored by a boom in art fairs, a boom in museums. If you think that in China today there's more than 10 biennials, But there's hundreds of new museums that are opening, new art fairs that are opening, and so on. Is there a relationship between these different?
I mean, for the general audience, do you think there's a great distinction made between going to an art fair, going to a biennial?
Not per se, no. I think that's one of the criticisms of biennials is, are they really for specialist audiences? But I think in certain cases, biennials are must-see events. Increasingly people are going to visit Venice, where I would argue that maybe Documenta a generation ago was a very specialist event. Today, it seems to be on everyone's agenda.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, but I think that really depends again on the context, what it is. In Oslo, for instance, the biennial is wanted by the city because it inscribes itself in this highly important desire of bringing to people the arts and giving access to, which is very present, and which has been also very present in terms of the educational programs in the 70s within a social democracy. So how to bring arts and then how to bring it in the space of the city. So it really depends in the context why the biennial is born, because in the case of Oslo, has nothing to do directly with the art markets. Mm-hmm. Or with the bringing people or populist publics, as we have mentioned sometimes, but more to inscribe this biennial within the necessity of bringing the arts to the people.
You had a thought on that?
I'm just giggling to myself, recalling a recent event in Ho Chi Minh City. A leading historian and artist decided to hold an event that said, what is a biennial? And the only examples they were talking about were art fairs. And they were talking about Art Basel, Art Basel, Hong Kong, Art Stage Singapore. There was no biennial actually in the presentation. So I think there's a need to understand that the biennial is also a framework in many parts of the world that is a status symbol. And wholly only attached to market CV notches for an artist. There's, I think, a dangerous growth of these exhibition platforms that only curtail themselves to how much money an artist is going to make at the end. I've had myself in the research for Sharjah been quite astonished at how many commercial gallerists get quite upset with me because I've visited their country but haven't sat down for the 10-minute marathon interview with their stable. Does research exist behind curating a biennial? It's a very complex answer there because, of course, you don't want to... I don't like biennials with the only curator stamp. I think it's all about the artist in my book. But I think there's a need to really understand biennials mean different things in different parts of the world.
Let me go to this question of it's all about the artist. I mean, all of you actually have spoken in these terms. When you as curators are thinking about your job, curating a biennial, do you feel that your primary responsibility is to the artist or to the audience that will see the work?
Just have to clarify, I'm not a curator, so
right.
But I've been involved in organizing a biennial, so It's all about the artist. Absolutely, it's about fulfilling their vision, really, in the context of the exhibition. In some ways, once the artist is invited, and the project has been confirmed.
You know, for me, it's about the relationship between the artist and the audience, and that the artwork and the artists is just the beginning of a conversation. If you don't ground it in, you know, what is a biennial, to me is a less interesting question than who is the biennial for.
Exactly.
And I don't think it's for the artists alone. It has to be about the thousands of people who will have an encounter that they wouldn't otherwise have. And the artists are a very important, obviously they provide the catalyst for this conversation, but you know, as a curator, your job is to build the bridge, and hopefully it's as short and swift and direct a bridge as possible, and you know, to set out a framework that allows the artists to make sense and to allow people to make connections But that who is it for becomes very interesting when you look at who actually goes to a particular biennale, because a lot of the interested parties, meaning the gallerists, the artists, the funders, and the curatorial community, shows up for the opening, and it feels like this is a very international, global event, as it does here for the first 2 days. But by the last day here, it's a Basel art fair for people who live in Basel. And for most biennials that I know, they are really for a local audience. And so you're really working on behalf of a local or a national audience.
Maybe you go ahead.
No, but I was going to say, yeah, that for me it's also very important, of course, the artist, but also the audience. I mean, that in our case, for instance, in public space where the works are not attached to the institution, where maybe the hierarchies between the texts indicating what the person should see and the works have dissolved and all these things, how do you show all that, and how do you approach these works to the people? This is very, very important for us.
But I suspect, though, that one of the reasons some people, the general public, confuses biennials and art fairs and other exhibition formats is that while there may be lots of different art on view, that mode of interaction, the way that we set the terms of engagement are actually rather similar, that there's a kind of homogeneity of form. And well, you may agree or disagree with that, but I'm curious if you agree that there's a lot of biennials that sort of look alike and feel alike. Why is that, and how can we break out of that mold? Because it seems that you can go to many biennials, but in the end, they do follow a fairly established template of presentation.
I think that's true for many other platforms within the art world. You know, museums are proliferating, but they all tend to look and behave in the same way.
Right, but biennials don't need to look. I mean, they would seem to have more flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, well, we do see a kind of merry-go-round of a group of curators who seem to be doing a lot of biennials, who then have a coterie of artists and who they work with, and artists who sort of make biennial type work that seems admissible to a biennial or professional biennial audience. But I think that, you know, each audience will have its own specificity. I mean, you know, an audience in South India is going to be different to an audience in Sharjah. I think one has to take, but it's difficult to see what comes first. I think audiences are created in a sense, and certainly in our case, you know, we have to consider that people can go to the cinema with their family for an afternoon, and that's also a cultural activity. Or they can choose to go to an exhibition called a Biennale, which has a different cultural purpose. So, you know, we sort of somehow put art or contemporary art in these regions on a pedestal, but there are lots of other cultural forms that people have a choice to access.
Ralph, are you thinking about how to break out of molds?
Yeah, definitely. But I think one thing that makes them all alike, I think, is this imperative to represent a region. And so you often have lots of artworks together that don't necessarily speak the same language. And so there's a sense of this difficulty in making connections between them that I think afflicts a lot of biennials. The scale is another thing that, especially the larger ones, are really inhuman in scale. I mean, it's not a pleasant experience to go and look at 100 artists' installations in a day or two. But some of it is economics. And I think, you know, one of my first ideas for Venice was to invite 100 artists to come and make their work there for a month. And ideally, you would then have the artists in residence for months. But nobody can afford to do that. Nobody can take off that much time. It would be too expensive to actually house and feed everybody and pay for their new work. I was at the Dakar Biennial earlier this year, and the main venue is a fairly decrepit former government building with no climate control of any kind. A lot of several key works that were supposed to be in the show were seized at customs or disappeared. And I thought, wow, it would be great to have this become a site-specific biennale, where you only invite artists to make work on site in relationship to this marvelous site that doesn't have museum conditions, but it's got beautiful decaying architecture. That would be a different kind of model. And I think that would make sense economically. But so I hope that happens. I mean, I think we haven't been very imaginative in how these things are approached.
I think that maybe two other things which seem to be fairly constant, that there is a almost full commitment to new work in most biennials, including freshly produced work, commissioned work, not as much involvement in past. And there's also kind of tonality that seems to, you find across biennials, a kind of very earnest, very hard-working kind of educational ethos. Not that that's a bad thing, but you mentioned that we're competing against an afternoon at the movies. We could also be more fun. So I'm curious if you have any reflections on these sort of meta frames as well.
Well, I do think there is a seriousness that overtakes the average Biennale curator because you feel you have this global responsibility. I mean, there's never been a funny Biennale, right? Someone who just said, I'm going to make a Biennale where people are going to laugh when they see this. And there are lots of great comic artists. So I do think, yeah, this sense of mission and a missionary kind of like desire sometimes might limit us.
Giggling inside again.
Well, I come again to speak from where I live. Artists and their role in the world is only as entertainers. They're decorators, they paint pretty pictures, they're rarely granted the opportunity as houses of memory that matter. And that's why we don't have much of a healthy art market, because the seriousness is absent. So from where I stand, there's a certain responsibility, I feel, in showcasing art as a very serious human form of production. I take your point that, you know, we are competing with the cinema houses that are offering you Hollywood blockbusters, but I think we are in a little bit of a crisis mode with the role of artists in society today. We have an art market more and more telling us that it's a dollar point and that it is just entertainment, but then there's vast swaths of the world where we don't even have historians that can be honest about what's going on. So when it comes to formats of exhibition making...
You'll stick to the serious.
No, I think it's possible to make the serious an incredibly humorous experience.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Shweta.
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of mentioned this earlier, that how art is taught today, how curatorial studies are taught today on the subcontinent, various parts of the world, it's a global trend. And so lots of different kinds of art forms, which were specific to these regions, have been flattened out in the process, certainly in the last 30, 40 years. And I think it's accelerated as we moved into our smartphones and we are starting to see and look and sort of interact with art through our phones. And I think that, for instance, in the last Kochi Biennale, which was curated by the artist Sudarshan Shetty, he really tried to bring in different kinds of practitioners into the conversation. So theater, performance, poetry, writers, and so on. Not just from the subcontinent, but from around the world, in order to, I think, to unpack some of these questions. I see less of that. I think that, there's a kind of a curatorial model that's being propagated along with this sort of biennialization.
Right, which, by the way, connects to a lot of the educational. We could really get into the whole idea of teaching. There's been a hardening of these models because we're now teaching people how to be curators, and that's a whole other topic. I just want to do a quick check. How many questions do we have in the room? Because that will define how many questions I will ask, because if there appears to be none, but I'll come back in 2 minutes. Okay, that may be okay, good. So before we go to that, looks like solitary question, the looming thing which has emerged from many of your comments is and which we can hear buzzing in the background, is the market and the relationship of biennials to the marketplace. You mentioned, I think it sort of crept into many of your comments. So let's just talk candidly and honestly about this. What exactly is or should be the connection or disconnection between biennales and the marketplace? Eva. Microphone.
It's not an easy question. You ask it to the person, me, who has been working always for public institutions, fully financed. I've been running a collection also. What should be the...
Are you thinking about the fact that even though you're doing a public project and you are clearly not coming out of a commercial realm, that by putting artists in the public space, you are inevitably positioning them also from a commercial standpoint?
I think everything can be commercialized, of course, and that we will be working most probably in some cases with galleries in the making of those works, and that can have a consequence afterwards. But I don't know, the way I have been, my experience working with the commercial, I mean, with the market has been always maybe in the production phase to work with the galleries, and then and that's it, more or less. So I don't really have an answer to you.
Okay, Rob.
I mean, there's no separating most art from a market, but I don't think biennials should have any connection to the market. And I don't think showing someone in a biennial really makes much difference now, because there are 300 plus biennials. It's no longer such a badge of honor that you were in a biennial. In fact, when I was curating the Lyon Biennale in 2015, it was actually hard to get anyone's attention. Artists were like, well, I've got 3 other biennials I'm doing this year. Can I squeeze this in? And I was thinking, gee, after Venice, this is like the largest biennale in Europe. But, you know, we've got an overexposure of biennales. But the market connection, I don't think really should exist. It doesn't mean that you're not going to ask galleries to support their artists, or that you have to look for outside sources of funding that have market connections, but they're not influencing what you're doing, or shouldn't be. Yeah. Whereas here, you know, there's lots of great art on display in Art Basel, but it's being shown with a different motivation.
It's a transparent motivation, whereas in many biennales there's works.
But look what we're doing here. This helps decorate this rapacious marketplace and make it look like it's an educational forum, right? All art fairs now like to have parkour events, things for the public, so they don't look like it's just some, you know, wild open marketplace that somehow manages to get supported by an international bank, as if it was a charitable activity. You know, so we're participating in this gloss on the art fair as well.
Just Jane Morris is here in the audience. We were talking about an art newspaper article, I think, from a few years ago, where some economist had looked at major museum shows in America over the last 10 years and found that it was predominantly artists coming from 5 galleries. That research wasn't followed up for various reasons, I don't know why, but it was interesting, and I've thought about that. And so one of the questions we looked at is, where does the funding for biennials come from? And it's very difficult to say. But I think with many things in society today, I think if you follow the money, you find out, you know, you get another context of where things are coming from. Obviously, international agencies are funding biennials, corporates are funding biennials, governments are funding biennials. To what extent and what happens to the work afterwards? I think if we look closely at that, one can sort of start to see the web of interaction, economic interaction. So I don't think the market is the bogeyman in any way. I think it's omnipresent, as Ralph said. I think it's very hard to escape it. But I think that we are reluctant to ask questions because we're also reliant on funding. I think in the last documentary, if I'm not mistaken, Adam Shimczyk did say that he was not taking any money from galleries. And I think that many galleries were very irate. So, you know, this is a subject that we don't really discuss to any great extent, but I think it deserves more attention.
And this is also covered in your report a little bit?
We try to. It's very difficult. In some cases, you can tell who's funding things, but in other cases, it's not so easy. You know, in the case of Chinese biennials, where you see, you know, this distinction between public and private corporations or state-owned corporations and so on, cities that are funding. So clearly this is part of a larger cultural policy that is taking place. So these are sorts of intricacies that you know, what we've tried to do, and that's why it says draft on the cover, is set up a set of data points, not for the data per se, but in order to be better informed at asking new questions. Because I think till now the discourse has been, you know, we know that, you know, the Bergen Conference, which led to the biennial reader, which led to a whole sort of field of studies, which has now been sort of amalgamated with post-colonial studies and so on. So we want to ask a new set of questions. So we thought that, you know.
Yeah. There was that one question. Is it still alive? Wait, there's a...
Yes, it's a very short question. It's about the economy of knowledge, and because you bring up the issue of new ideas and curiosity, and it's when you start a project and you ask artists for new proposals and new ideas, there are always many which are not realized. So what happens to all these project proposals and new ideas, texts, and all which will not be exhibited? And then it brings up a lot of layers of, I could also say censorship, but I think the economical question is also very interesting about this shared creative commons, like how ideas, political ideas, knowledge circulates, and how you can protect curators and how you can protect artists in this situation. I mean, by economy, I mean the content of the knowledge, not the financial aspect.
What?
You mean, if I understood well, the question first was what happens to the projects?
What happens to the unrealized projects and the documentation?
That the document, yeah. I mean, in our case, the artists that are invited, the artists are first invited with a contract, and they are paid for that to submit an idea, and then we move forward or not. That happens also in architecture and in other disciplines. Huh? Yeah. So there is a first contract, which is, of course, remunerated. And then this is kept. If it is not, we are not moving forward with the idea, then this is the artist can use it afterwards for another project. So it's not that the biennial is going to keep it.
In my line of work, again, where I live, there's many exhibitions I've done in my head with artists because we don't have public spaces to make them happen. So unrealized projects are actually a part of life for me. There are so many in my own head where I proposed for other biennials and did a lot of work and they never occurred. I've worked with a lot of artists on major proposals for works that due to certain budget or space or political circumstances were not able to happen. And we continue to talk about them, we continue to make them better. And one day I really do hope that we can do them. Some of them may appear in my biennial, but I think that this notion of being asked to respond to something and whether or not it is realized or not realized is an important journey in itself.
Great. Well, we're coming to our end. I'm going to ask my last little closing question. I think we've managed to circumnavigate a number of issues, and there's a lot more in this report. Just to touch on what Ralph was saying, I think certainly one of the great things that's happening in the world is this sort of continuing hybridity across the art world, whether it's art fairs, putting on cultural events, or biennales, connecting in, all parts of this ecosystem are connected. But my question, really, my last question is, where is the room for innovation? You're all actively working on biennales, you're students of biennales, you're looking at past biennales, and we know there are more than 300 of them, but there will be more people somewhere around the world, some group of people, maybe here at Art Basel, are meeting to say, let's launch another biennial. So what advice would you have for those people if they were to make a biennial that's different from other biennales? Let's start with you and we'll come this way.
I mean, I think one thing we didn't talk about, but it was the change in content in the last 20 years, has been the phenomenon of the emerging dead artist, which is rediscovering artists who, for one reason or another, were not particularly well known or have been forgotten about, and incorporating them into a biennale structure. When I first started seeing biennales, they were very much like a report on the last 2 years of artistic activity and a survey of that. And now increasingly, there was more and more historical figures in them. So that's been a change. Mm-hmm. But what I would say is just to concentrate on the format and the structure. That's where innovation needs to happen, not on the themes and the thematics.
And we'll be looking at your responses to that, I think after
Yes,
June,
I
when
hope
you
not
can
to
talk
let you
about
down.
it. Eva.
I think that has to do also with the format, because it really depends where are you talking from, once again, and what is the context you are working with, that you would need this time frame or another, for instance, or this type of format or another. So it's very much linked to where are you talking from. And I think that the format is something that is innovating in many cases.
Shwetal, what advice would you have for the next group?
I think to look at your specific site and to work from bottom upwards instead of a top down. So not to eschew models and instead propagate a practice-orientated approach. And I don't just mean curatorial practice or artistic practice, but a range of practices that go into creating these kinds of events. Because increasingly we're entering a period of homogenization, of a sameness that's creeping. So every new biennial that launches is sort of almost wants to emulate and join an international club. And there, I think, is where the homogeneity is creeping in. So I think that we need to be very conscious of where we're working, who the audience is, the history of that place, the language, the different artistic forms and practices that make up that place.
Get the last word.
I think for me it's impact. What's the impact you want to leave and produce? I also asked myself, is it possible for a curator to be a historian? Do we have the capacity to create new kinds of narratives with our work? So when I hear of new biennials popping up, it's about who's putting it together and what impact are they seeking to leave.
Well, everyone, I want to thank our wonderful speakers, and I invite you to go out into this other great marketplace of international global art, living artists and emerging dead ones as well. Enjoy the show. Thanks very much, and see you in Sharjah, see you in Oslo, and see you in Venice. And see you in Kochi this fall.